Her husband was cheating. Everyone thought Evelyn Vance was the last to know. No one suspected that the affair was a trap she had set herself, by sending her best friend, the one woman who looked exactly like his first love, straight into his arms. The hunter had become the hunted, and the real game was only just beginning. Evelyn scrolled through the anonymous posts on the company forum, her thumb moving slowly across the screen. Did you hear? Someone walked in on Mr. Cross and the new finance director, Claire Foster, doing it right in his office. No way. Isn't she Mrs. Cross's best friend? Yep. And get this, Mrs. Cross is the one who got her the job. That's insane. Rich people drama is something else. She read every comment, one after another, 23 in total. Each one should have stung like a needle piercing the skin of a betrayed wife. But there was no shock, no panic, no anger. Only a slow, quiet smile spreading across her lips, the kind of smile that had nothing to do with joy and everything to do with certainty. A husband cheating with his wife's best friend. The story was so cliché it bored her. But what no one would ever guess was that this cliché had been stitched together by her own hands, thread by thread, over the course of months. She took a screenshot and sent it to William Crawford, Bill, as she'd called him since childhood, the man who had been her father's right hand for 30 years. She typed 5 words, "The fish took the bait." Then she set her phone down, switched off the lamp, and slid under the covers. Outside, a deep winter wind rattled the bare branches of the ginkgo tree in the garden. The heating hummed softly, wrapping the bedroom in a cocoon of warmth. Evelyn closed her eyes and felt something she hadn't felt in years, peace. Not the shallow peace of denial, but the profound, steady calm of someone who has finally seized the reins of a carriage that had been careening downhill for far too long. From this moment on, the marriage that had spiraled so far out of her control was back in her hands. As sleep began to pull her under, her mind drifted, unbidden, to a different winter. College. Julian as he used to be. He was nothing like the man he'd become. Back then, the winters had been colder, heavier with snow. She'd been a chronic oversleeper, slapping the snooze button until the first lecture was half over. But no matter how late she dragged herself out of bed, there was always a figure waiting at the bottom of her dormitory stairs. Julian in that faded black down jacket, his collar turned up, his ears red from the cold. In his hands, a thermal bag. Inside, a cup of soy milk, always exactly 65 degrees, hot enough to warm her, never hot enough to burn, and a breakfast wrap, 2 eggs, no cilantro, extra chili sauce. He never got the order wrong. I timed it, he'd said once, his voice flat, as if he were explaining a math problem. 7 minutes from the cafeteria to your building. The milk starts at 95 degrees. After 7 minutes, it drops to 65. Optimal drinking temperature. There had been a light in his eyes when he said it, something earnest and meticulous that she'd mistaken for love. She thought, a man who calculates the cooling curve of your morning drink must care for you more than anything in the world. She didn't know then that he was only recreating gestures he'd learned for someone else. That the 65-degree soy milk, the 2-egg wrap, the careful timing, it had all been done before, years earlier, for a girl with a delicate stomach who skipped breakfast. A girl named Liana Shaw. Evelyn rolled over in the dark. The ghost of a bitter smile crossed her lips. I was so stupid. That morning, after her usual yoga session, Mrs. Bailey came back from the farmer's market with a plump free-range chicken. The poultry stall had beautiful birds today, Mrs. Cross. Fresh, bright-eyed. They'll make a wonderful broth. Evelyn glanced at the chicken, and an idea surfaced. She hadn't been to Julian's office in weeks. She had no real desire to see him. These days, they moved around each other like polite strangers sharing a house. But staying away too long invited gossip, and gossip was bad for business. A pot of chicken soup delivered with a warm smile would play the part of the devoted wife perfectly. She called him several times to let him know she was coming. The phone rang and rang, each call rolling to voicemail. No answer. Fine. She'd go anyway. At the office, she moved through the hallways with a smile stitched firmly in place, nodding at employees, handing out the pastries and bubble tea she'd picked up on the way. Some faces were familiar, but most were strangers now. She and Julian had founded this company together, Cross and Vance Environmental Solutions, and it had grown fast, fed by her family's connections and capital. After she stepped back from daily operations, the staff had turned over like leaves on a tree, too quickly for her to keep track. She set the treats down in the break room, exchanged a few pleasantries with the old-timers, and headed straight for the executive suite. Julian wasn't there. She stood for a moment in the doorway of his office, her eyes sweeping over the broad mahogany desk. Everything was arranged with almost obsessive precision, files stacked at perfect right angles, pens aligned parallel to the desk's edge. He had always been like that, a man who imposed rigid order on his external world, as if that could keep the chaos inside him from spilling out. She turned to find Darren, Julian's assistant, standing in the hall. His expression was carefully neutral, but his posture was slightly too stiff, like a man bracing himself. "Where's Mr. Cross?" "He's out meeting a client." Darren's voice pitched a half-tone higher than usual. His gaze flickered away from hers and landed somewhere over her right shoulder. "Which client?" Evelyn asked casually. She still knew the major accounts by heart. A ripple of unease moved across Darren's face and then smoothed itself out. "He left early this morning to meet with a client. I'm not sure which one." Evelyn held his gaze for 2 seconds longer than was comfortable. She saw the tiny tell, the slight flare of his nostrils, the nearly imperceptible shift of weight from one foot to the other. Darren had been with Julian for 4 years. He never said, "I'm not sure," about anything. She already understood 7/10 of the truth. But she let it go, tucking her suspicions away as neatly as folding a fan. "Then I'll take the soup home. He can have it tonight." She walked out of the building and into the biting winter air. She sat in the driver's seat of her car without starting the engine, staring at the glass facade of the office tower. It reflected the thin winter sun in cold, hard glints. Then she started the car and drove west, toward the suburbs. The villa was one of Julian's holdings, purchased under a shell company he thought she didn't know about. After the warmth in their marriage had cooled, she'd asked Bill Crawford to look into his finances. Bill had spent a year excavating every hidden asset, every secret account, every property whose paper trail didn't lead back to Julian's name. The villa was where Julian took his women. Evelyn parked a few blocks away and walked the rest. The neighborhood was quiet, all red-tiled roofs and towering evergreens, the kind of privacy that was perfect for hiding things. She stood at the front door and stared at the keypad. 6 digits. She tried Julian's birthday. Nothing. She tried Liana Shaw's birthday. The lock clicked open. Evelyn looked at the door swinging inward and laughed softly, a dry, mirthless sound. Of course. She stepped inside. The living room was empty. On the coffee table, an open bottle of red wine and 2 glasses. One of them was printed with a vivid red lipstick mark, a bold, confident shade that was nothing like anything she owned. She climbed the stairs. The carpet was thick and gray, swallowing her footsteps. The bedroom door was ajar. Through the gap, she saw exactly what she'd expected. Julian, his back to her, a young woman beneath him on the bed. Not Claire. Someone new, long dark hair fanned out across a white pillow. Evelyn didn't enter. She stood in the hallway, watching with a strange, detached clarity, as if she were observing a film about someone else's life. She felt the images hit her retinas, felt her pulse beat steadily in her throat, but the connection between what she saw and what she felt had been severed. Another new face. Over the years, he'd cycled through so many women she wasn't sure she'd kept track of them all. But they'd always troubled her with a vague sense of familiarity. Something about the eyes, or the curve of a mouth, or the angle of a jaw. Something she could never quite name. She was about to turn away when her eyes caught a splash of color on the floor at the foot of the bed. A red floral print dress. Evelyn froze. The blood in her veins seemed to stop and then surge all at once. Her heart skipped a full beat and then slammed against her ribs. That dress. She had seen that dress somewhere before. A thump from inside the bedroom, a phone falling off the bed. The two figures shifted, searching for the source of the noise. Evelyn didn't wait. She fled down the stairs, out the door, back to her car. She locked the doors and sat gripping the steering wheel, her hands trembling, not with rage, but with the electric shiver of a long-buried truth rising to the surface. She drove home faster than she should have and went straight to Julian's study. The room was full of her touches, the bookshelves she'd organized, the art she'd collected, the calligraphy scroll her father had given them as a wedding gift. A room saturated with her presence, yet every secret it held belonged to someone else. She rifled through drawers, felt behind shelves, dug into the deepest corners of the filing cabinet. At the bottom of a drawer, wedged behind a stack of old notebooks, she found a photograph. Julian and Liana. They stood together under a ginkgo tree, both in high school uniforms. Julian's smile was young and unguarded, his eyes curved into crescents of genuine, unfiltered joy, a face she had never once seen him wear. The girl beside him leaned her head against his shoulder. She had a tiny beauty mark at the corner of her right eye, full lips, and a smile that seemed to radiate summer even in a faded photograph. Evelyn stared at the girl's face, and pieces she'd been unconsciously gathering for years suddenly snapped into place. Liana Shaw. Julian's high school classmate. His first love. The girl who'd been sent abroad by her family after graduation, the one he was told he could never have. Evelyn had pieced this story together from fragments Julian had let slip over the years, offhand mentions he probably hadn't even realized he'd made. She'd always told herself it was ancient history. Everyone had a past. She had even found this photo once before, when they were newlyweds, and had quietly tucked it back where it belonged, telling herself it was only natural for him to keep a memento. But now, she looked at the photo. Then she replayed the image of the woman on the bed. The long limbs. The full curves. The beauty mark at the corner of the right eye. A perfect match. And the floral dress. The red floral dress crumpled at the foot of the bed. It was the same dress Liana was wearing in the photograph. In a rush, all the other women flickered through Evelyn's mind, a parade of faces she'd found vaguely familiar but could never place. Those eyes. Those mouths. Those beauty marks. She finally understood. He hadn't been cheating. Not in the way she thought. He had been searching. Every woman, every affair, every nameless body in his bed, they were all pieces of the same puzzle. Each one bore some fragment of Liana Shaw, and each one, ultimately, was discarded because a fragment was never enough. And the reason he'd married Evelyn? Because she looked nothing like Liana. Because waking up next to a face so completely different from the one he'd lost meant he wouldn't have to remember. Wouldn't have to ache. Evelyn stood very still in the middle of the study, the photograph in her hand. She had thought she would feel pain. Instead, what rose up in her chest was something heavier and more suffocating, a wet blanket pressure that made it hard to breathe. She flipped the photo over. On the back, in faded blue ink, was a line in Julian's handwriting, * autumn 2009. The one I couldn't wait for, *. She stared at those words until they blurred, then slid the photo back into the notebook and set about tidying the desk. As she gathered the scattered papers, a document caught her eye. The cover read, Evergreen Environmental Technologies, Supply Chain Proposal. Evergreen was where Claire had worked. The proposal detailed a core project Claire's team had spent a year developing. Evelyn flipped through it, and the more she read, the colder her blood ran. It laid out Evergreen's proprietary technology and supply chain architecture, annotated with phrases like acquisition via equity swap and below-market valuation transfer. Evergreen. Claire's project. The poaching of key talent. Claire's sudden resignation. Evelyn had always suspected Claire's firing was more complicated than it looked. Now the answer was sitting in her hands, stamped with her husband's fingerprints. She photographed every page, then walked out into the garden. The winter air hit her face like a splash of cold water, but it did nothing to slow the whirring in her brain. She sank into a patio chair and let her mind replay the fragments she'd overheard at the villa, snatches of a conversation she'd been too distracted to process at the time. Liana needs another round of funding. We need to move faster on the divorce proceedings. I'll handle the asset side, just give me a few more months. Divorce. Assets. Liana. He wasn't just cheating. He was preparing. Liana's marriage was reportedly failing, her husband had a gambling problem, and their overseas investment company was hemorrhaging money. Julian was draining the Vance family's wealth to build a lifeboat for his first love, and when the boat was ready, he would hand Evelyn a divorce agreement and sail away. She picked up a small mirror from the patio table and looked at her own reflection. Pale skin, round doe eyes, a face people had always described as sweet, innocent, the picture of a wholesome girl next door. She'd never lacked for admirers. The woman in the photograph. Bold red lips, upswept phoenix eyes, golden waves of hair, a figure that curved with aggressive, unapologetic sensuality. Two completely different archetypes. Julian hadn't chosen her type because he was drawn to it. He'd chosen it because it was safe. Because looking at her would never remind him of the girl who got away. A bitter smile touched her lips. She set the mirror down. Then her phone buzzed. A message from Bill Crawford. Your father's heart trouble is acting up again. He's been worried about you, says you've lost weight, that you're carrying something heavy. He asked me to look into Julian. I found things, Evelyn. Things I don't know how to tell him. The tears came then, sudden and hot. She sat in the garden for a long time, the winter wind chapping her wet cheeks. Her father had never approved of Julian. She'd fought her parents tooth and nail for this marriage, convinced that love would prove them wrong. For years she told herself they'd come around, that they saw how successful Julian had become, how well he provided. She'd been proud of proving them wrong. But her parents hadn't come around. They'd just stopped saying it out loud. She'd been married 7 years, and her parents had worried for every single day of those 7 years. Enough. She wiped her face with her sleeve and typed her reply, * don't tell Dad. Give me 3 months. I'll handle it myself, *. Then she stood up, walked inside, and splashed cold water on her face until the redness around her eyes faded. She looked at herself in the bathroom mirror, water dripping down her chin, and watched her own gaze harden. The turmoil inside her didn't disappear, it froze. A frozen lake, still on the surface, dark currents churning underneath. She reheated the soup, ladled herself a bowl, and sat at the kitchen table, eating slowly. The broth was rich and warm, the ginger and goji berries sweet on her tongue. She couldn't remember the last time she'd finished a proper meal. The doorbell rang. Julian was home. Evelyn set down her spoon, blotted her lips, and checked her reflection one more time. She arranged her face into a smile, gentle, attentive, utterly non-threatening. The smile of a perfect wife. She had practiced it many times. Then she walked to the door to welcome home the man she was about to destroy. The entryway light clicked on. Julian bent to remove his shoes, polished Oxfords, a charcoal suit tailored within an inch of its life, his tie still knotted with immaculate precision. He looked like what he was, a CEO who hadn't yet shed the armor of the workday, handsome in a cold, untouchable way. Evelyn watched him from the foot of the stairs. The same man who, hours earlier, had been tangled in hotel sheets with a stranger. Now he stood in her hallway, every hair in place, his shirt cuffs aligned exactly half an inch below his jacket sleeves. A beautifully bound book with every page inside printed with lies. "You're home," she said softly. He stepped into his house slippers and moved past her without his gaze lingering. The same neutral tone he always used, carefully stripped of emotion. "I made chicken soup today. I was going to bring it to your office, but you weren't there, so I brought it back. Come have some while it's hot." She took his briefcase, her movements easy and practiced. She wasn't sure if anyone at the office had told him she'd stopped by. Better to volunteer the information herself than let him sniff out something amiss. "Right. I was out meeting a client all afternoon. Sorry I missed your calls." Julian followed her into the kitchen and wrapped his arms around her from behind as she ladled soup into a bowl. It was a gesture that looked, from the outside, like affection. But Evelyn felt the truth of it instantly. His forearms rested loosely across her shoulders, but his chest didn't touch her back. His chin didn't dip to her hair. Even his breath seemed angled away from her neck. A gap of maybe 3 centimeters, precisely maintained. A hug that was really a cage held at a careful distance. It hadn't always been like this. He used to press his whole body against her, chest to spine, his face buried in the curve of her neck, his breath warm and ticklish until she squirmed and laughed, and he'd chase her ear with a kiss. Even in the dead of winter, the heat of him would spread through her like a shot of whiskey, chasing away every chill. Now there was only the cold. A cold that seeped through layers of fabric straight into her bones. Love and its absence. There was nothing more obvious once you knew how to look. Bodies didn't lie. When love died, even the embrace of a man who shared your bed became a piece of careful choreography. Evelyn bit down on her lower lip, hard, and let the sting anchor her. Don't go soft. Not now. He's not the boy who counted the minutes for your soy milk. That boy died somewhere, years ago, and you didn't even notice the funeral, By the way, Julian said, scrolling through his phone with one hand while spooning soup with the other, his eyes never lifting to meet hers, "Christmas is coming up. HR organized a team-building thing this Friday, Disneyland. You should come. Sounds fun. I might have to leave early, though. Mr. Harrison is flying out Saturday morning, and I need to see him before he goes. If you don't want to be alone, bring Claire along." "Okay." Claire Foster was Evelyn's best friend from college, a sharp, ambitious woman who'd climbed to finance director at a publicly traded company by the age of 27. She'd recently resigned, creative differences, with the board, and was taking some time off before looking for her next role. It'd be good for her, Evelyn added. She's been cooped up at home since she quit. A day out would do her good. Really? So she hasn't lined up her next move yet. To Evelyn's surprise, Julian stopped scrolling. His head lifted. She registered the movement with the precision of a seismograph. The speed of that head lift was too fast. Too keen. Like a hound catching a scent on the wind. Not yet. She wants to rest for a bit. Oh. He returned to his soup, his tone flattening back to its usual disinterest. Just a single syllable. But that split-second reaction had been enough. Years of memories shuffled and resorted themselves in Evelyn's mind. Every time she and Julian had attended a social event together, company outings, dinner parties, weekend trips, he'd always urged her to invite Claire. So you won't be bored, he'd say. So I won't worry about you. She thought it was considerate. She'd even teased Claire about it. He's just overly careful. Now the pattern rearranged itself into something far more calculated. After dinner, Julian retreated to his study. Evelyn sat in the living room, the television murmuring unwatched, and scrolled through Claire's social media. Big waves of hair. Tall, statuesque frame. Lips perpetually painted a bold, confident red. Liana. She set the two faces side by side in her mind. The resemblance was unmistakable, had been there all along, really, but Claire's personal style was so different from Liana's. Claire was a blazer and trousers woman, crisp and professional. Liana was sultry, draped in silk and danger. Evelyn had simply never made the connection. Now she did. And as she scrolled, a plan began to crystallize. She opened her messaging app. Shopping tomorrow. The reply came almost instantly. You finally remembered I exist. Yes, please. I've been hibernating so long I'm starting to grow moss. Tomorrow, then. I have a lot to tell you. Can't wait. Red heart. Evelyn set her phone down and walked to the window. Across the garden, the light in Julian's study glowed cold and white through the slats of the blinds. She stood in the dark of her own bedroom, looking at that rectangle of light, and felt the distance between them as a physical thing, a stretch of frozen ground, impossibly wide. The next day, they met at their favorite shopping district. After a leisurely browse through a few boutiques, buying nothing of consequence, they settled into a quiet corner of a cafe. Outside, the sky was a muted gray, and pedestrians hurried past with their collars turned up against the wind. Claire wrapped her hands around a latte and studied Evelyn with the practiced gaze of someone who'd known her for over a decade. All right. You've got that look. Spill. Evelyn didn't smile. She looked at her best friend and decided, with a clarity that surprised her, to hold nothing back. She told Claire everything. Julian's affairs. The villa. The rotating door of women. Liana Shaw, the high school sweetheart, the white moonlight he'd never stopped chasing. Julian's plan to drain the Vance family assets and funnel them overseas to rescue Liana from her failing marriage. The red floral dress. The photograph. The realization that every woman Julian had ever touched was a stand-in for the one he couldn't have. Claire listened without interrupting. Her latte went cold in her hands. Her expression passed through shock, disbelief, and finally settled into something Evelyn rarely saw on her friend's face, a slow, cold-burning fury. That bastard, Claire said quietly, the words clipped and precise, like a scalpel. Evelyn let out a shaky breath. Yes. That bastard. She confided in Claire before about the growing distance in her marriage, the chill that had crept into their bed. But she'd never wanted a divorce. The ties between the Vance family and Julian's business interests were too tangled. She'd resigned herself to a facade of mutual respect. And Claire, as always, had respected her choice. But this wasn't distance. This was larceny. Claire's mind went back to high school. Her own parents had been school teachers, comfortable, but far from wealthy. They'd tutored Evelyn on weekends, and the Vance family had always been grateful. Then, in her senior year, Claire's father died suddenly. The medical bills had swallowed everything. On the cusp of college, Claire had stared down the very real possibility of dropping out. It was Robert Vance who'd paid her tuition. Every semester, without fanfare, without expectation. Claire had worked 3 jobs through college, earned every scholarship she could, and repaid the money within 2 years of graduation. But the debt she felt, the deeper one, the one no dollar amount could settle, had never left her. The Vances had given her a future when she had none. Now someone was trying to rob them blind. Don't cry, Claire said, reaching across the table to grip Evelyn's hand. Her palm was warm, her grip firm. His love, or whatever the hell that was never real. Let it go. What matters now is the money. Your money. Your father's money. How much has he taken? I don't know. He's careful. He never talks about the finances in detail, and I've been afraid to push too hard and tip him off. Evelyn shook her head. I'd need someone on the inside. Someone in the finance department. But that's not my territory anymore. Claire was quiet for a moment. Then she spoke, her tone shifting into something speculative. You said I look like Liana. Yes. And all those times Julian told you to invite me to things, he was the one who wanted me there. Yes. I didn't realize it until now, but, yes. Claire tilted her head. So why didn't he just go after me in college? If I'm such a dead ringer for his precious first love. I don't know. Men are mysteries wrapped in idiocy. Claire laughed, but it was a laugh with an edge. Then her expression settled into something harder. What if I became the bait? Evelyn's hand tightened on hers. Claire, no. I know what you're thinking, and I can't ask you to. You're not asking. I'm offering. Claire shrugged, her voice light but her eyes serious. I'm unemployed. Julian's company needs a finance director. You said he's been looking for an excuse to get me in there. Let him think it's his idea. Let him think he's the hunter. When Evelyn still hesitated, Claire leaned forward. Your father gave me a life when mine fell apart. If I stood by and watched someone steal from him, I wouldn't be able to live with myself. She said it simply, without drama. A statement of fact. I'll do it. Evelyn lay in bed that night, staring at Claire's message on her phone. I'll do it. 3 words. A stone dropped into still water. The ripples were already spreading farther than she could measure. She typed back, *OK. But we set ground rules, *. Shoot. *1, you protect yourself at all times. 2, you keep me updated on everything, no gaps, no secrets between us. 3, if at any moment you feel uncomfortable, you pull out. I don't care if we have 0 evidence. Your safety matters more, *. A long pause. Then, deal. Evelyn looked at the photo frame on her nightstand, her wedding portrait. She was in white, beaming, tucked against Julian's side. He was almost smiling. 7 years ago. She picked up the frame, studied it for a long moment, then laid it face down on the table. The glass met the wood with a soft, final click. Friday. Disneyland. Evelyn arrived slightly later than Julian, timing her entrance with care. She wore a cream wool coat, her hair loose around her shoulders, her makeup minimal. The image of gentle, unthreatening grace, exactly the kind of wife Julian expected her to be. She spotted him near the entrance, deep in conversation with a cluster of department heads. No suit today. Dark gray cashmere sweater, long black overcoat. He stood like a man who was used to being looked at. Handsome as the devil, Evelyn thought, and twice as cold. Evelyn. Over here. Claire's voice cut through the crowd. Evelyn turned, and blinked. Claire had outdone herself. A wine-red wrap dress hugged her figure, topped with a black leather jacket. Her hair tumbled in glossy waves, and her lips were painted a deep, daring crimson. She looked like a flame burning in the middle of winter. The resemblance to Liana Shaw was no longer subtle. It was a punch to the face. What do you think? Claire murmured as Evelyn reached her, a mischievous glint in her eye. You're not exactly being subtle. Subtlety doesn't catch fish. Claire linked her arm through Evelyn's. Relax. I know what I'm doing. Evelyn glanced across the plaza. Julian had noticed. His gaze had landed on Claire and held for perhaps 2 seconds before he looked away and resumed his conversation. 2 seconds. Evelyn saw it. She knew that look, the slight widening of the pupils, the reflexive tightening of the jaw. The look of a man who'd been ambushed by a memory so powerful it short-circuited his composure. And it had been directed at Claire. The day passed in a blur of rides and team photos. Julian spent most of it walking alongside the HR director, discussing year-end reviews. He glanced back at Evelyn occasionally, checking her location like a supervisor ticking a box. A model husband in every visible way. At 5:30, Julian left early. Before he went, he patted Evelyn's shoulder, one brief, weightless tap. Don't stay too late. Okay, she said, smiling. As he turned, he passed close to Claire. She shifted her weight slightly, and a wave of her hair brushed against his sleeve. Julian's stride hitched. Just a fraction of a second. Then he kept walking, didn't look back. But Evelyn saw it. Claire saw it too. The fish is swimming, Evelyn thought. That night, she didn't go home. She and Claire booked a room at a hotel near the park, claiming a girls' night. Julian responded with a single okay. No questions, no protest. In the hotel room, Claire wiped off her lipstick and changed into an oversized hoodie, shedding the persona like a costume. She sat cross-legged on the bed, looking more like the Claire Evelyn knew, sharp, direct, unsentimental. He's hooked, Claire said. He looked at me 4 times today. The last time was in the parking lot. He was in his car, staring at me through the window for a good 3 seconds before he drove off. 4 times, Evelyn repeated. Does that bother you? Evelyn considered the question. No. What bothers me is how easy it was. All it took was someone who looked like her, standing there. He couldn't help himself. So what was I, for the past 7 years? Just a placeholder who didn't remind him of anything. Claire had no answer for that. Neither did the universe. Bill's been digging, Evelyn said, changing the subject. She pulled up a document on her phone. These are the assets my father's name is tied to that Julian has touched. 3 years ago, Julian convinced Bill to help with some equity transfers, expansion plans, he called them. My father was in the hospital at the time with heart trouble. Most of the paperwork was signed on his behalf. Claire took the phone and scrolled through the list. Her expression grew darker with each line. 15% of Evergreen Environmental. Yes. That's exactly when your project was poached. Julian used his new stake and the Vance family's connections to cut off Evergreen's supply chain at the knees. Claire went very still. So my resignation, the creative differences, that was collateral damage. Julian stole my project, and the board needed a scapegoat. Evelyn's eyes burned with guilt. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. The person who cost you your job, I was married to him the whole time. For a long moment, Claire said nothing. Then, unexpectedly, she smiled, a smile that was all sharp edges and cold resolve. Good, she said. Now I'm not just doing this for you. I'm doing it for me. They didn't sleep that night. They mapped out every step of the plan, testing each angle, anticipating every countermove. Claire drew a mind map on hotel stationery, Julian's assets, his network, his psychological weak points, all connected by arrows and annotations. His obsession with Liana is his fatal flaw, Claire said, tapping the center of the map. A man who's cold-blooded in every business dealing loses all reason when it comes to her. As long as I can make him feel like she's within reach again, his defenses will drop. So I become her. Not just the look, the walk, the voice, the way I laugh. Every detail. He'll be so busy thinking he's caught a ghost, he won't see the cage closing around him. Evelyn looked at her friend, this woman who was about to walk into the lion's den wearing the scent of its lost mate, and felt a wave of emotion she couldn't quite name. Gratitude, fear, love, grief, all tangled together. Claire. Stop. Claire held up a hand. This isn't your fault. He's the one who lied, who stole, who used you. He's the one who turned his obsession into a weapon. We're just turning it back on him. Evelyn looked out the window. The sky was lightening, the first pale streaks of dawn breaking over the city. She thought about college, about the boy with the 65-degree soy milk. About how she'd spent years telling herself a story about love that had never been true. He wasn't learning how to care for me, she thought. Asterisk, he was just replaying old tapes. Everything he gave me, he'd already given to her first, asterisk. By early December, Claire Foster was the new Deputy Finance Director at Cross and Vance Environmental Solutions. The hiring process was smoother than Evelyn had expected. Julian interviewed Claire for 20 minutes, asked a handful of routine questions, and told HR to fast-track the paperwork. Evelyn, playing her part, posted a celebratory photo on social media, the three of them smiling, her arms linked through Claire's and Julian's. So proud of my best friend joining the Cross and Vance family. The post collected over 100 likes. Colleagues gushed about what a supportive wife she was. Julian himself clicked like. Bill Crawford called her that night, his voice tight. Miss Vance, are you sure about this? Involving Miss Foster directly, it's a tremendous risk. I'm sure, Bill. Did you find out who bought Evergreen's shares? A pause. They were sold to an offshore investment firm registered in the Cayman Islands. The beneficial owner is Richard Shaw, Liana Shaw's husband. Evelyn closed her eyes. I figured. The pieces she'd overheard at the villa clicked into a coherent picture. Julian wasn't waiting for Liana to leave her husband. He was actively financing her escape. Richard Shaw had gambling debts and a failing company. Julian was using Vance's money to make those problems disappear. Once Liana was free, Julian would shed Evelyn like a worn-out coat and step into the life he'd been planning since high school. "We can't wait any longer," Bill said. "We won't. Just be ready to cut off the offshore firm's funding when I give the signal." "Understood." Evelyn went to Julian's study again and opened the notebook with the photograph. She looked at the faded inscription on the back, *Autumn 2009. "The one I couldn't wait for, *. She thought about her mother, who'd once taken her aside before the wedding and said, "Julian is too guarded, sweetheart. When he looks at you, it's like he's checking for something. Like he's making sure you're not someone else." She dismissed it as maternal overprotectiveness. Now she understood. A woman's intuition wasn't paranoia. It was a radar that picked up frequencies men didn't even know they were broadcasting. Mid-December. The plan began to yield results. 2 weeks into her new role, Claire was assigned to a core project, the very one that had been stolen from Evergreen Environmental. The project lead was Vincent Hale, a man Julian had personally recruited from overseas. Claire quickly discovered irregularities. "He's splitting the project funds," she told Evelyn over an encrypted call, her voice low and rapid. 17 separate transfers, routed through a dozen shell accounts, all converging at one offshore company. "I've cross-referenced it with Bill's intel. It's the same firm. Richard Shaw's company." "How much?" "Over $3 million so far. And I think there's more I haven't found yet. The really sensitive documents are paper only, no digital copies. I need to get into Julian's office." Evelyn's stomach tightened. "That's too dangerous. His office has security logs on the door. I'll find a window." Claire's tone was breezy. "He's been finding excuses to drop by the finance department all week. Last Friday he bumped into me working late and took me out to dinner." Evelyn's grip on the phone tightened. "You went 3 times now. Sushi, French, and last night he discovered an amazing little Italian place. He always starts with work questions and then slides into personal territory. Hobbies, travel, favorite films. Last time he asked if I had a boyfriend. What did you tell him?" "That I had one, but we broke up." Claire laughed, and there was a hunter's satisfaction in it. "You should have seen his face. He was trying so hard to look casual, but his eyes lit up like a kid who just found out Christmas came early." Evelyn absorbed this in silence. "Are you jealous?" Claire asked, more gently. "No. It's just the way he collects people who look like her. The way you're using his fixation as a weapon. The whole thing is disgusting." "It is," Claire agreed. "But you can't afford to feel sympathy for him. He's not going to feel any for you when he hands you that divorce agreement and walks away with everything your family built. Remember why we're doing this." "I know." Christmas Eve arrived with a cold snap that glazed the streets in ice. Julian announced, unexpectedly, that he wanted to spend the holiday at home. Evelyn understood the calculus immediately. A CEO's Instagram-worthy Christmas dinner with his beautiful wife was a necessary piece of branding. She spent the afternoon decorating. Fairy lights wound around the tree, gold bells and silver snowflakes catching the glow. The kitchen filled with the scent of roast chicken and mulled wine, cinnamon and clove warming the air. She curated every detail, every angle, until the house looked like a magazine spread of domestic bliss. When Julian walked in, he stopped in the entryway and stared at the scene. The lights reflected in his eyes, tiny sparks in the dimness. "Do you like it?" Evelyn asked, tilting her head with the practiced sweetness of a woman who'd learned to perform. "It's beautiful." His voice sounded rough. "You worked hard." "Not really." She rose and walked to him, helping him out of his coat. The fabric was cold and carried a faint trace of cigarette smoke. He'd been smoking again, though never in front of her. "Remember Christmas our junior year?" "Of course." He looked down, his lashes throwing shadows. "We ate in the dining hall. You said the chicken legs were too small and gave me yours. You'd lost 10 pounds prepping for that entrepreneurship competition. I was worried about you but didn't know how to say it." She'd smuggled him extra food for weeks, always pretending she'd bought too much, always pretending it wasn't a big deal. That was how she'd loved him, quietly, insistently, wrapping her care in layers of casualness so he wouldn't feel burdened. Julian reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. The gesture was slow, almost tender. Once, it had made her heart flutter. Now she felt only the coolness of his fingertips and the ghost of a muscle memory that no longer meant anything. "Let's eat," she said, turning toward the dining room. She caught the flicker in his expression as she turned. He wasn't thinking about her. He was thinking about Liana. Maybe Liana had once given him her chicken leg in a high school cafeteria. Maybe Liana had tucked her hair behind her ear just like that. Evelyn was an echo of an echo, and Julian's mind was always somewhere else. The Christmas Eve warmth was as thin as tissue paper. By late December, the atmosphere at the company had begun to shift. Veteran employees whispered in break rooms. The new deputy finance director, they said, was scrutinizing old expense reports with an intensity no one had seen before. Several large payments with questionable approvals had been flagged, their disbursements paused. Then Bill called with an update from his offshore investigation. Julian's overseas assets had ballooned in value over the past quarter. The growth traced directly back to the core patents transferred from Evergreen Environmental. "He's pumping Vance resources straight into Liana's side," Bill said, his voice flat as a frozen rail. "Not just money, technology. Evergreen's water purification patents, the ones they spent 3 years developing, are now registered in Southeast Asia under Richard Shaw's name. Evergreen can't expand into that market without paying royalties to the man who stole from them. Can we prove it? I'm pulling together the patent filings and the corresponding bank transfers. But there's more. Julian is accelerating the cash drain. He signed several large purchase orders with shell vendors at inflated prices, all routing back to the same offshore accounts. If this keeps up, Cross and Vance will be a hollow shell by spring." Evelyn closed her eyes and saw the red floral dress crumpled at the foot of the bed. She thought about the woman wearing it, Liana or one of her substitutes, and wondered, for a moment, how much choice that woman had. Trapped in a failing marriage, watching her husband's debts pile up, and then her old flame appears with promises and a rescue plan. Was she a villain or just another piece on Julian's chessboard? It didn't matter. Julian had already bet everything. And a gambler whose all-in never folds until he's forced. Mid-January. The coldest stretch of the year. The city's sidewalks were crusted with gray ice, and the trees glittered with frozen droplets, sharp as glass. Claire's plan entered its final phase. She had collected evidence of Vincent Hale's fraudulent transfers, the 17 split payments, the email chains with the shell companies, the inflated procurement contracts. Only one piece remained, the original share transfer agreement for the Evergreen stake, the document bearing Julian's signature. It was the keystone of the entire case, and it was almost certainly locked in Julian's office. The opportunity came on January 15th. Julian flew to the West Coast for a 2-day business trip. Before he left, he sent Claire a message, "Let's grab coffee when I'm back," followed by a coffee cup emoji. Claire screenshot it and sent it to Evelyn. "He's making his move. Are you ready?" "I've been ready for a year." At 10 o'clock that night, the office building sat dark and silent, only a few scattered windows still glowing. Claire stayed late under the pretense of catching up on reports, waited for the security guard's final patrol, and then swiped the access card she'd quietly duplicated weeks earlier. Julian's office door clicked open. His desk was immaculate as always. Claire ignored the surface and went straight for the unobtrusive steel cabinet in the corner, short, gray, the kind of thing you'd mistake for a supply closet. It was secured with an old-fashioned combination lock. No digital footprint, no audit trail. Secure in its very analog simplicity. She knelt and tried the first set of numbers. Julian's birthday. Nothing. Evelyn's birthday. Nothing. She drew a breath and dialed 𝐿𝐿𝐼𝐏𝐓𝐈𝐎𝐍's birthday. The lock opened with a soft, definitive click. Inside, a stack of files, meticulously organized. On top, the English language contract, the sale of 15% of Evergreen Environmental plus 3 core patents to a Cayman Islands entity called Lighthouse Holdings. The sale price was less than 30% of market valuation. The signature at the bottom was Julian Cross. The date was December 24th, 3 years ago. 3 years ago, Julian had told Evelyn he had a late client dinner. She'd waited up until 2 in the morning, the Christmas dinner she'd made sitting untouched on the table. He'd come home smelling of wine and a stranger's perfume, said the clients were difficult, and collapsed into bed. While she was keeping his dinner warm, he was signing away her family's assets. Claire photographed every page. Then she pulled out the next file. A divorce agreement. Party A, Julian Cross. Party B, Evelyn Vance. The terms were breathtakingly brutal. All company equity, properties, and assets under Julian's name would remain his. Evelyn would voluntarily forfeit all claims to marital property. Julian's signature was already on the document, dated 3 months earlier. Evelyn's line was blank. He'd had it ready, waiting for the right moment to slide it across a table and say, "Sign here." Claire's hands shook, not with fear, but with a kind of white-hot fury she hadn't felt in years. She'd seen corporate dirty tricks, backstabbing, theft. But this was her best friend. This was the woman whose father had paid for her education, whose family had treated her like a daughter. And Julian Cross had planned to leave her with nothing. She forced herself to focus and reached for the last item. A letter. The envelope was yellowed, the ink faded. Addressed to Liana, signed Julian. The folds of the paper inside were so deep they threatened to tear. Claire unfolded it and read. Liana. Asterisk, this is the last letter I'll write you. Tomorrow I'm marrying a girl named Evelyn Vance. She's in our class, sweet, naive, from a family with the kind of connections and capital I need. You understand, don't you? Men like us, without a dynasty behind us, we have to build our own foundations. I need her family's resources, asterisk. Asterisk, but you have to know, you are the only woman I've ever loved. From the first day of freshman year, and it will never change. Wait for me. Once I have enough power to control everything, I'll come for you, asterisk. Asterisk, I couldn't wait for you to come back. So I'll build a future you can come back to, asterisk. Yours always. Julian. Winter 2009. The date was the night before his wedding to Evelyn. On that night, Evelyn had been in her room, twirling in her wedding dress in front of the mirror, giddy and tearful with happiness. Claire had been texting her silly bridesmaid jokes. Evelyn had fallen asleep believing she was the luckiest woman in the world. And Julian had been writing a love letter to someone else. Claire photographed the letter, replaced everything exactly as she'd found it, and locked the cabinet. As she walked out of the office, her hands were slick with sweat, but her mind was cold and clear. She went straight to Evelyn's house. Evelyn sat on the sofa in her robe, looking at the photographs on Claire's phone. The contract. The divorce agreement. The letter. She read the line, "The only woman I've ever loved," and her face didn't change. She just sat there, quiet and still, the light from the screen reflected in her eyes. Finally, she spoke. "He married me for my family's money. From day one. It was never real." Claire didn't try to fill the silence. She just took Evelyn's hand and held it. 9 years, Evelyn said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I gave him 9 years. My parents were right. I was too stubborn to see it." She picked up her phone and called Bill. "Bill. We have everything." February arrived with a cold that wouldn't loosen its grip. But inside the company, the temperature was rising. The line between Julian and Claire had been drawn taut enough to hum. Gossip swirled through the office like pollen. At a team dinner, Claire drank just enough to seem loose-lipped and murmured, "Mr. Cross has been really good to me," her voice trailing off in a way that invited speculation. By the next morning, the rumor mill had churned out a dozen versions of the story. Evelyn read the posts on the anonymous company forum. Strangers dissecting her marriage, inventing salacious details about her husband and her best friend. She scrolled through every comment with a detachment that surprised even her. Then she took a screenshot and sent it to Bill. The fish took the bait. She'd been waiting 3 months for exactly this moment, for the rumors to become so loud that Julian would feel secure in his delusion, for Claire to be positioned deeply enough to access the final evidence, for every piece of the trap to be locked in place. It was time. March 7th, Evelyn's 29th birthday. Julian cleared his schedule. He booked the penthouse restaurant of the city's tallest building, the one with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view that made the whole city look like a carpet of scattered jewels. He wore her favorite navy suit. He ordered her favorite dishes, lobster, foie gras, a bottle of burgundy white. A dessert plate arrived with "Happy Birthday" written in chocolate script. He was performing the role of the devoted husband so flawlessly that Evelyn almost admired the craft of it. She wore a simple beige dress, her hair pinned low, the pearl earrings he'd given her years ago. She looked exactly like the wife she'd always been, soft, demure, safe. "Happy birthday," Julian said, raising his glass. "Thank you." She clinked her glass against his. The sound was a single bright note that dissolved into the hum of the restaurant. The wine was dry and a little bitter. "Evelyn." Julian set his glass down and looked at her with an attention he rarely gave her anymore. His gaze was steady, direct, almost warm. "There's something I want to discuss. Business matters." "Oh. The market's shifting. I'm restructuring some of the company's holdings, moving a few things offshore to hedge risk. It's all routine, but there are some documents you'll need to sign. Equity transfers, mostly. Temporary, of course. Once the overseas division is stabilized, everything will revert." Evelyn looked at him. This man, who could lie without a flicker, who could sit across from her with another woman's lipstick probably still staining his collar, she had loved him once. She had loved him with her whole, stupid heart. She let her gaze drift to the edge of his collar, where, half hidden beneath the fold, a tiny red mark was visible. Not her shade. She never wore red. Julian, she said, her voice softening, I have something to tell you too. What is it? I'm pregnant. The wine glass in his hand paused. A micro-flinch, there and gone so fast most people would never have noticed. But Evelyn noticed. She'd come to this dinner precisely to see it. When did you find out? Last week. The doctor said 3 months. Everything looks perfect. She touched her stomach, allowing a radiant, hopeful smile to bloom on her face. Julian's expression flickered. He set the glass down and reached across the table, covering her hand with his. His grip was firmer than usual. Why didn't you tell me sooner? I wanted to surprise you. She tilted her head, eyes bright. Do you like your present? It's the best gift I could ask for. Evelyn lowered her gaze, hiding the ice behind her eyes. She wasn't pregnant. She had never been pregnant. It was a test. And Julian had failed it. His reaction hadn't been joy or surprise. It had been fear. The fear of a man who saw a child not as a miracle, but as a chain that would bind him to a life he was already planning to leave. She smiled at him across the candlelit table and thought, *happy birthday, Julian. This is the last gift you'll ever get from me, *. March 15th. The quarterly board meeting. Evelyn walked into the conference room wearing a sharp black suit, her hair pulled back in a sleek ponytail. Behind her came 4 people, Bill Crawford, silver-haired and ramrod straight, carrying a heavy document case, 2 attorneys in dark suits, and a family representative who'd served the Vance empire for 3 decades. Julian was already seated at the head of the table, paging through the agenda. When he looked up and saw the procession, his pupils contracted sharply. Evelyn. What's going on? She didn't answer him. She pulled out the chair directly opposite his and sat down, removing her gloves with deliberate slowness. I'm here for the board meeting. As the company's largest shareholder, holding 42% of the equity, I'm entitled to attend. Article 16 of the corporate charter. A heavy silence settled over the room. Several of Julian's allies exchanged uneasy glances. Julian's jaw tightened, then released. His expression settled into a cold, unreadable mask. Of course. You're always welcome. I'm glad to hear that. Evelyn smiled, perfectly polite. Because I'll be attending regularly from now on. Bill, distribute the materials. Bill opened the document case and passed a folder to each board member. Julian's eyes tracked the old man's movements. He'd known Bill for 20 years. He tried, at various points, to co-opt him, to sideline him. But Bill was like an ancient tree, too deeply rooted to move. The meeting unfolded in its usual rhythm. Project updates, financial reports, annual projections. All perfectly routine. Until the finance director paused on a line item flagged in red. This oversees project expenditure, he said, adjusting his glasses. A total of $3.2 million, dispersed in 17 installments to an entity called Lighthouse Holdings. The payment approvals are in order, but we haven't received the corresponding procurement contracts or project completion reports. Per company policy, any single disbursement over $500,000 requires a full archival package. I wanted to ask. That's a standard overseas investment, Julian cut in smoothly. We're expanding into Southeast Asia. Lighthouse is our local strategic partner. The paperwork is being processed. It'll be filed by next month. What about this contract? Evelyn's voice cut across the table, quiet but carrying. She pulled a document from her attorney's briefcase and slid it to the center of the table. 15% of Evergreen Environmental. 3 core water purification patents. Transferred to Lighthouse Holdings at less than 30% of fair market valuation. The signature on the bottom belongs to someone in this room. She didn't say the name. She didn't need to. Every pair of eyes turned to Julian. Julian's fingers tapped the table, twice, a little faster than before. Where did you get that? From the combination safe in your office. Evelyn's gaze was level, unblinking. The password is Liana Shaw's birthday. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Julian rose slowly to his feet, pressing his palms against the tabletop. He loomed, the way he'd loomed over opponents in 100 negotiations, using his height and his presence to intimidate. Evelyn, do you understand what you're doing? Perfectly. She stood as well, meeting his eyes without flinching. She was shorter than him, but in that moment she seemed to tower. I'm protecting my family's assets. Over the past 3 years, you've used fraudulent contracts, false transactions, and related party shell companies to transfer more than $17 million of company funds to personal offshore accounts and entities controlled by you. Every dollar traces back to Lighthouse Holdings, and Lighthouse Holdings traces back to Richard Shaw, the husband of your high school sweetheart, Liana Shaw. She gestured. One of the attorneys stepped forward and laid a thick stack of documents on the table. These are your transfer records, email chains, offshore account statements, contract copies. Would you like me to read them aloud, or shall we just skip to the part where you sign everything back? Julian scanned the faces around the table. Shock, anger, betrayal, and on the faces of his allies, a poorly concealed panic. He looked at Evelyn, really looked at her, maybe for the first time in years. The obedient wife. The quiet, unthreatening partner. The woman he'd underestimated every single day of their marriage. How long have you known? Since the first affair. Since the first woman you took to the villa. Since the first time you brought a stranger into our bed who had a beauty mark next to her right eye, and I didn't understand why that detail made me feel like I was losing my mind. Her voice remained steady, but something old and buried trembled beneath it. You thought I'd never figure it out. You thought I'd stay the clueless little wife forever, signing whatever you put in front of me, while you emptied my family's coffers to rescue the woman you really love. But I've been watching you for 3 years, Julian. 3 years of playing the devoted wife while I catalogued every lie. Julian's face had gone pale. Claire. You planted her. You're smarter than you look. Evelyn's smile was thin and sharp. Yes. She was my eyes and ears inside your fortress. And you couldn't help yourself, could you? She looked so much like Liana. You were already imagining her in that red dress before she'd even finished her first week. Silence swallowed the room. Julian stared at her as though seeing a stranger. This face he'd woken up next to for 7 years. This voice he'd heard 1,000 times. He'd never actually seen her. Evelyn held his gaze. The words she'd been holding back for years finally broke free, a flood she no longer wanted to contain. Did you ever think about me? Once? All those women, all those years, every one of them a stand-in for her. You never saw me. I was just a resource. A stepping stone. A convenient body who didn't remind you of the one that got away. She paused, swallowing hard against the burn in her throat. But you know what hurts the most? You wrote her a letter the night before our wedding. The only woman I've ever loved. I was in my room, trying on my veil, thinking I was the luckiest bride in the world. And you were writing love letters to someone else. Julian opened his mouth. Evelyn. Don't. The word was ice. You don't get to call me that anymore. She pushed a final document across the table. Here's what's going to happen. 1. You'll sign this asset restitution agreement, returning every cent you diverted offshore back to the company. 2. You'll relinquish all your equity and resign from every position you hold, with a lifelong non-compete clause barring you from the environmental sector. 3. You'll sever all ties with 𝐒𝐓𝐿𝐼. Stop funding her husband's debts. Stop building your future with my family's money. Julian looked at the document. A strange, hollow laugh escaped him. And if I refuse? Then tomorrow morning, these files go to the SEC and the FBI's Economic Crimes Unit. Securities fraud. Embezzlement. Money laundering across international borders. You'll have plenty of time to write letters from a federal penitentiary. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. The city glittered beyond the windows, indifferent. Julian looked out at the skyline he'd spent a decade climbing. Then he picked up the pen. The scratch of the nib against paper was the only sound in the room. He signed his name, a signature she'd seen on 100 documents, but never one that cost him so much. He set the pen down, picked up his coat, and walked to the door. Julian. He stopped. Didn't turn. Evelyn's voice softened, just slightly. The photograph. In your notebook. Under the ginkgo tree, autumn 2009. The one I couldn't wait for. She paused. Did you ever get to? For a long time, he didn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was almost too quiet to hear. No. Then he opened the door and walked into the night. ####epilogue. 1 month later. Evelyn sat in the chair of her new CEO office. Outside, April had arrived with a riot of willow catkins swirling through the air like a second snow. The trees were budding, the grass turning green, the whole city finally shaking off the long, brutal winter. Bill knocked and entered, carrying a financial report and a legal notice. His step was lighter than it had been in years. The offshore assets have been fully recovered. 17 million, plus the evergreen stake. The court's unfreezing the shares next month. As for 𝐒𝐓𝐿𝐼, her husband's been arrested on money laundering and gambling charges. She's filed for divorce. Evelyn nodded, turning the pages without really reading them. Miss Vance, are you all right? I'm fine, Bill. She smiled, and this time the smile reached her eyes, tired, but real. It's just strange, that's all. It's over. Really over. I thought I'd feel more. But mostly I just feel empty. In a good way. Like a house after all the clutter's been cleared out. Bill nodded slowly and withdrew, leaving her alone with the spring light. Evelyn turned her chair toward the window. April was the best month in the city, the sky a clean, scrubbed blue, the sun warm but not yet aggressive. She cracked the window open and let the breeze in, smelling earth and new grass and the faint, sweet scent of cherry blossoms. Her phone buzzed. Claire, heading to the West Coast next month. Clean energy startup wants me as their CFO. Want to come with me for a few days? You could use a change of scenery, asterisk. Evelyn smiled and typed back, asterisk absolutely. This time, I'm the one buying the drinks, asterisk. She opened the drawer of her new desk and took out the photograph frame. Her wedding portrait. The girl in the white dress, beaming with a hope so pure it hurt to look at. She gazed at that younger self for a long, tender moment. "You were so naive," she whispered. Then she slipped the photo out of the frame and tore it in two. The half with Julian's face went into the trash. The half with her own face, the girl who'd once believed in 65 degrees soy milk and forever, she kept. Some parts of the past didn't need to be thrown away. They could stay, not as wounds, but as reminders. Asterisk, this is who I was. This is what I survived, asterisk. Outside, the first spring rain began to fall, soft and fine. It caught the drifting catkins and carried them gently to the ground, where they lay like flocks of white birds finally coming home. Evelyn extended her hand out the window, letting the rain bead on her palm. Cool. Clean. Alive. The smell of wet earth and new leaves rose up, the scent of things growing, of things beginning again. She was 29 years old. And everything was still ahead of her.